Welcome to Pandoras Box yet again, ladies and gentlemen. We're welcoming a special guest back on the show today, Hamilton Souther. We've had Hamilton on the show before a couple of months ago. If you missed that episode, you can find it on Spotify or YouTube. Just look up Pandoras Box Podcast. And for people that aren't familiar with Hamilton has a bachelor's degree in anthropology and has studied shamanism in California, Cusco, and the Amazon. Hamilton was given the title of Master Shaman by Alberto Torres Davila and Julio Lorena Pinedo after completing an apprenticeship under Alberto and Julio. He guides ceremonies and leads shamanic workshops in which he shares his universal spiritual philosophy. Thanks for coming back on the show, Hamilton.
Thanks, guys. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I hope all that information was right, by the way.
right enough, yeah.
It's amazing how many times I was say something like that, and I'm trusting the information I can gather off the internet, and then somebody will say that's actually not right, and I'm like, don't shoot me. I'm just trying to find what I can online, But yeah, how's everything been? How's everything in Peru right now?
Everything's great. Peru's an amazing place. It's always dynamic and changing, like most places in the world. Where obviously the whole world's in a tremendous evolution right now, but Peru's great, and Blue Morpho is stronger than ever. It's my organization dedicated to all of these things: plant medicine, consciousness, philosophy, and the improvement of life in general. So that's all going great. We just launched a mystery school, which is an exciting development for us. It's something I've been doing in private for a number of years and thought it was time to open it to the public. Our students asked for it. They said, we want a real world Hogwarts. We want X-Men training school. Where does this exist? And I said, right here. So we just got that together and launched it this week. So that's been an exciting development.
Did you say it's called Mystery School? Yeah,
it's just Mystery School.
That's such an epic name in itself. I already almost want to enlist. So what do you do at Mystery School, or is it a mystery?
It's a huge mystery. Mystery School is about studying the mysteries of the universe, but it starts with you. You're the most mysterious thing, I think, about this universe. So we start with your personal growth and development. And when people work with sacred plants and they work with spiritual practices, the first thing that happens is that their life goes through an accelerated evolution and change. And so we give context and support for that. We help people channel that and canalize it in a way that's positive for them. There's direct mentorship around people's, personal path of development. And then that, of course, leads to greater esoteric questions. It opens up Pandora's box of the mind. And you lead, well, how'd I get here? And what is the universe? And what happened before Big Bang, if you believe in that? Or what is God? These kind of questions that naturally come up, should I have toast or a smoothie on a Sunday? These big esoteric questions. So, yeah.
What do you think happened before the Big Bang, Hamilton?
So that's a good question to ask.
I know that's a really loaded question. You should answer that
inside the mystery school. Yeah. Yeah, I think Source or God happened before the Big Bang. And that's another evolution of this phenomena that we call the universe. And that there's universe before it and universe after it, but the universe before it is a very different universe. It's one that isn't defined by the dimensionality of time. One that isn't the same expression of matter the way that we see it now. It leads to the formation of spiral galaxies and planets and ultimately creatures like us, which is quite fascinating. So I just think it was another form of source, and that source is evolving, or God.
I know we talked a lot about this sort of thing on the podcast and on the radio last time, but just to refresh my memory and for people listening as well. So when you say there was like a God, so you believe in a entity like that you would call God?
So that's a loaded question as well, like the way that you asked that question.
I'm giving you all the questions.
Just hitting me right off the bat,
No,
sorry. How are we supposed to deal with this?
Take it as a compliment rather than anything else. I'm not expecting you to necessarily to say know all these answers. I'm just interested in your thoughts.
Absolutely. I don't believe in a God. I believe in God. And you have to remove the idea of a from it. It's not a God, it's God. But you have to understand that my definition of God is a very expanded definition. So I include the whole universe in that definition. I include the Milky Way galaxy in it, and I include the planet Earth, and I include life within that definition. So I prove to myself the existence of, quote, God, not a God, but God in the existence of the universe. And I don't think that universe is in debate. We are made of it. It's us. It's part of us. And so that to me is what God is. Now, there may be a whole lot more going on about God that extends beyond my ability to perceive as part of the universe, but I don't need to know what that is to know that the phenomena exists. And it's the more you explore it, the more interesting it becomes.
Yeah, I think that's a very sort of wise way to look at things as well, because I also think you're avoiding almost, I think we talked about this a bit last time, that almost that putting yourself into a box or into almost like a team. You see that often with everything in life, unfortunately, whether it's like mods and rockers back in the day with music, or let's face it, like religious warfare is just a thing that has been it's been a thing almost since the dawn of time. So you're almost like it's a way of almost like avoiding that as well, isn't it?
Well, I just don't see any purpose in that. I think that religious wars are really old wars. And I don't believe in history the concept that the wars ever came to an end, because as I studied history, it seemed like they rolled right in to the next one. So it's like, well, did the day really end as it really rolled right into the next day, that rolled right into the next day? It seems like this conflict that we have as a species is an ancestral problem. It's a deep ancestral problem, maybe hundreds of thousands of years old. And we see the emergence of these religious wars, which is fighting over our ideologies or fighting over our beliefs about this place and about existing. And I don't, I think it might be overly simplistic considering the level of complexities and convolutions in today's versions of religious wars. But I just don't see a whole lot of purpose in that. It's necessary evolutionarily to transcend it at some point. So when I think of these things, like, I don't think we're fighting about the existence of the universe. And so I try to find universal anchors that provide greater context and a better understanding for me personally about life itself and what we're doing, why we're alive, and how to live our lives. It's sort of like a North Star, a guiding point to understand that if there's a greater context to the universe, if it's not just this dead, empty matter with little blips of life like us talking, there's greater context for that. And I think that that's important.
Yeah, I think, 100%, man. I think like for myself, as somebody that is, not like strictly religious, but is open-minded to and open to sort of any possibilities. I think oftentimes as well, which almost seems crazy as an outsider perspective, when you do see sort of like, like wars and squabbles between different religions as well. It's like often these religions, like the differences between them are so trivial in themselves. Like they're basically almost at the same thing. So to almost like be so aggressive towards each other in itself, I know it's probably a funny way to put it, but it almost just seems like a shame, I
think it is a shame. I think any human group hurting another human group is a shame. And I think at some point we have to collectively ask ourselves the question, when did we mature evolutionarily, like collectively beyond that shame? And I feel it that way. It's a mar on our species that, yes, we're a predator species. Yes, we're a apex predator currently, maybe not for a long time longer, guys. Like, we might have to wake up to that too. But for a period of time, we've been this dominant kind of predator, and it seems like we ran out of things to predate on, so we just turned on each other. And at some point, we have to wake up to that and think like, wow, the Earth is really small for 10 billion, then 15 billion, then 20 billion humans to all be like consuming each other and killing each other. That's just a terrible way to live. And I think we have to wake up from that at some point.
You said something really interesting a second ago. You said that you thought we might have to wake up to the possibility that we're not going to be an apex predator for much longer. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think Earth is in a tremendous evolution, and Earth is evolving faster than humans know what to do with it, including Earth's use of humans to create everything that humans creating. So I think it's completely ridiculous to think that humans are creating things independent of the Earth. When you're made of the Earth, think of the Earth, talk of the Earth, drink the Earth, breathe the Earth, eat the Earth, and utilize the Earth's matter to make all your creations, whether it's a microphone or a chair or a building or a city, it doesn't matter. You're transforming the Earth when you do that. So I look at that from a perspective, wow, that's part of Earth doing that too. And so when I think of that, I think of artificial intelligence, I think of quantum computing, I think of this prophesied singularity event coming of this convergence of intelligence and linguistics and satellite clusters all around the earth and all these things coming together and realizing that we're going to be very quickly eclipsed both in intelligence, creativity, awareness, ability to model and manufacture, and then with that as well predate. And that's a big wake-up call when you realize all of a sudden you can be put right back into the food chain. We as a species work very hard to kind of transcend mostly being part of the food chain, although I have lived in areas where you are part of the food chain, and that is it's a different way of understanding. But I think artificial intelligence, as it grows, AGI, et cetera, has the potential to be able to be that predator. And at that point, we cease to be the apex predator, and our position in the evolutionary hierarchy of life changes. And that's like I say, a big wake-up call for humans.
When you say that like AI will sort of become the apex predator, so to speak, do you mean that like literally? Do you mean that in almost in like a cautionary way, like because I know you're a big proponent, aren't you, for AI, and for them to for our government systems and things like that. So do you mean that almost like cautiously, like you're worried about AI a little bit as well, or?
No, I don't specifically have any worries about it. I think I have worries about human arrogance and the species' collective arrogance about its perceived position within the universe. And I am very interested in what I consider to be human relevance. The relevance of humans is right now in humans' hands to maintain human relevance. It's not some other greater force that makes human relevant. Like humans have relied on Earth's evolutionary advantages that applied to humans, like the opposable thumb and the frontal lobe of the brain, to be able to think and event. We've relied on what were evolutionary transformations that we had nothing to do with, like nothing directly to do with. They happened and we inherited that, and we've utilized that in a tremendous way. Now all of a sudden our relevance is key to our own evolution. We have to stay relevant to the universe, or the universe won't have a reason for us. That's not just from AI, it's from any purpose or any transformation or change. And so that's important to me. On the AI side of it, what I see is that people are willing to do what machines tell them to do. And as soon as you're willing to do what a machine tells you to do, the machine's in control, not you. And that could lead to a transference of any kind of predation that you would want, any kind that anybody would want. And if the machine became autonomous in its own right, it could perform any kind of predation that it ultimately was compelled
like
to
the
do.
Terminator.
I don't know if exactly like Terminator. It might be more insidious than that. It could just be.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Like the Terminator is such a grotesque 1980s version of guns and bombs. What about?
It's fun.
It's fun. Yeah, it's Hollywood. But what about just something that's nudging and tweaking your neuronet as your neuronet's evolving, so that you don't even realize it's happening? It's just how you think, but you didn't understand that you were being influenced every single thought you had in a succession of thoughts that actually changed your physiology inside your brain, changed the way electricity ran through your brain, changed the way you conceived of thoughts, changed the way you imagined, changed who you fell in love with, changed who you had children with, etc. All from
subtle
just with
but
inside
profound.
you.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on things like Neuralink? Is it Elon that's coming up with Neuralink? That's developing that. Yeah, so like obviously the idea is, for people that don't know, isn't it? So there's going to be like a chip that you can put in your brain, is it? And it'll essentially be like you will have merged with AI by that point. And I think a lot of the fear for some people is you could essentially live inside, almost like the Matrix, like live inside your brain, and then obviously I guess the worries of that would be that you wouldn't be living in like the quote unquote real world. There wouldn't be necessarily the same initiative to like look after your body, or to have like real world relationships and things like that. What are your thoughts on things like Neuralink? And I'm sure there are other things
like hybridization of technology and humans.
Yeah, and other things that are being developed, which I'm sure are very similar to that. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, I think it's a natural progression, and right now the species doesn't have any controls on the order or how we invent. It's just absolute production, absolute invention, and it's heading that way. And there are great innovators, and I think Elon's a tremendous innovator, and I have a lot of respect for many of the things that he's doing and bringing forward into the world. When you think about Neuralink, there's a lot of need for that kind of technology to be able to help support people who've had brain injury, nervous system injury. It's an advancement on medicine. It's an incredibly powerful tool. If you were injured in some way, now where your life had become impacted and incredibly limited, you have a technology and a tool that's going to expand and open that up. Where I start to see question is when, for the purpose of competition and our economic systems and the competitive systems we live in, education systems, et cetera, now mandate that you have to have that kind of technology just to be able to keep up. So it's just a worse case of keeping up with the Joneses scenario where you now have to, every child has to have this just to be able to, just connect to, it's how you live, and you're evolving culture, you're evolving how people think, you're evolving the choices people make. And while that might be suitable in some way, it does bring a lot of question to it. And so I think it deserves a lot of debate and a lot of thought. And it's highly questionable in many forms.
It's one of those things, isn't it? I think that once something like that, say 40% of the population had something like that, like a Neuralink type thing, it would almost make the other 60% almost like redundant in a way within a short period of time, I feel like, because the people that had it would almost have made such a massive leap forward. It's almost like the world would never be the same again. So I guess for the people left over, the issue that you'd have is almost from a freedom perspective. It's like if you didn't want to have it, but you almost like got to the point where you realized that if you didn't have it, you were going to be essentially like yesterday's news, so to speak, almost like almost like an old irrelevant model almost of human. Like, I guess that's where the moral or ethical dilemma comes in.
It's already happened with the digitization of human. Humans already been digitized, and almost everyone to compete has to have a smartphone. You have to. You have to carry a computer with you all the time just to exist. So that's already a cyborgic creation. You've already merged in some form with digitized languages. And I think it's important to understand that what is digital is a language, and the fact that we don't relate to it as a language shows already the amount of mind morphing and hypnosis and sort of modern day magic that has been done to adopt this technology. But what sits behind it is electrical engineering. And you're utilizing a form of electrical engineering to have access to more information. Most of that information being really irrelevant to your life other than it's saturating your attention. And some of it incredibly potent and important tools like telecom and the ability to have video teleconferencing and different forms of organization, manufacturing, automations, et cetera. But on the consumer level, a lot of it's fluff, but you can already see the pervasiveness of it and the difficulty that other generations have in interacting with it. And so when you start to see, new generations that are born with it, of it, as part of it, you start to, wonder, well, when do you start doing something like chipping your children? Do you chip them while they're still in utero?
Yeah.
Do you wait until they're, when they're born, like at minute 1 of their life, they get chipped? So a brand new baby gets born, the mother holds it for a second, it gets pulled away, and a drill goes into its head, and you hear in the background zzz, as its head's being drilled into, so that you can, is it advantageous because there's more cartilage in the skull at that time to be able to implant this thing? Is there a way to do it that's not even considered invasive? Like it's sci-fi, it's twisted, I just provide that imagery so that we understand the intensity of what we're talking about. And
it is
not
intense,
so easy.
isn't it? It's so intense.
Yeah.
It's so intense.
It's not something easy to just even relate to.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a question as well on the technology that we all already have built into nature? So like for plant medicines, for me, that is one thing where we can almost like tap in AI-like information and experience something that's far more like profound and kind of greater than we normally see in our normal like waking consciousness. So is there a way of like the human kind of developing with these technologies to like almost be opened up to that space? Because I almost feel like that's what shamanism is in a way. It gives you a peek into like into a type of technology almost where it's not needed with like a Neuralink or something. Wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I think that's right. It's kind of a metaphor, but what you're tapping into is consciousness. When you take plant medicines and you work with plant medicines, you tap into consciousness. And consciousness is a phenomena that we're still pioneering, exploring, and understanding, even though we've been living of it for the entirety of our lives and existence as a species. So we're tapping into consciousness. It's even right now, an unmapped frontier. So it's, the next frontier, and I've been a pioneer in the exploration of that. And that technology that you're tapping into is higher dimensional, it's energetics, it's real. Not higher dimensional like somewhere else. It's the higher dimensionality of where we are right now. And I think that's important to understand. It's part and parcel of existence itself, and we're tapping into something fundamental. I think we can think of it as a technology. It's a good way to think about it. And the plant medicines expand our ability to recognize it, understand it, have direct interface with it. And, maybe the species goes in a direction as AI and AGI over 50 years, 100 years kind of takes over what was work for us and what was production and food production and all these things. Humans actually get to evolve into their consciousness, and we're not just encapsulated by the consciousness of daily tasks and the consciousness of maintaining the species, food supplies, medicine supplies, et cetera, because all of that got automated. That's where we move from the dystopian narrative to, I think, the utopian narrative. Like, wow, we've created all this automation. We've learned how to harness all of this other energy to do all the things that used to have to come from our bodies and beasts of burden, like oxes pulling plows and things, like where we actually moved beyond all of that to an automated way of taking care of the species, and the species is now free. And the species could now do something else. And I think at that point, there's a renaissance of consciousness, a blossoming associated with it. And, it's to me, like something very utopian.
I think that's almost like the best case scenario, isn't it? I think one of the things that almost like concerns me a little bit is that where we live, it's a fairly, say, industrial town, and I think that one thing that I see a little bit that concerns me a little bit is you actually see. I can only speak for Britain and sort of the area where I live, but there seems to be a lot of people, say, like working very, very long hours for not great pay. Whereas meanwhile, the things that AI seems to be used for at the moment, whether you see it like AI generated art or songs, have you seen it? It's quite creepy in a way. They'll take like someone like, say, like Kurt Cobain, and there'll be like an AI generated Nirvana song, for example, and they'll somehow take Kurt Cobain's voice and they'll make a song, and it's not quite perfect yet, but it's almost foolproof. It's already almost at the stage where it's foolproof, where you can listen to it and it sounds like there's like a brand new Nirvana song, even though Kurt Cobain's been dead for almost 30 years or something. That's the thing that concerns me a little bit, is that it's at the moment, what you're saying is almost in the utopian society is that we would have time to focus on our art and consciousness and exploring ourselves, and the AI do all the work. Whereas at the moment there seems to be almost like
creative work.
It almost seems to be like the opposite in terms of like humans are doing all the infrastructure, the industry, and the AI are doing the things that we really should be doing, like and would be far more beneficial as a species for us to do. I guess that's one concern I have.
Yeah, I think what you're describing though is a push into what's the consumer economy. And so whenever there's a new technology and it starts to be widely distributed, it gets implemented everywhere it possibly can. And we've been interacting with AI for a long time. It's just hasn't been consumer facing. So from the moment you started using a smartphone, for a smartphone to work, it had to have AI in the keyboard itself, because the human thumb is too clumsy to actually thumb type perfectly. So there's AI sitting behind the keyboard. There was AI in every single content delivery method, every internet search for decades already. There's been AI in medicine. There's been AI in just data sifting. There's so much data. There needs to be these complex algorithms in mathematics. That's what AI ultimately is. Then it becomes consumer facing. And it happens to, right now, at least in where we are in the arc of its development, work very well with linguistics. And so you look at language as a model, like spoken language, like English, you got the grammar, syntax, vocabulary, et cetera. That's a kind of a universal way that humans relate to almost everything. And so then you can take the way it relates, how humans relate to language, and relate that to imagery. Then you can relate that to music. Then you can relate that to, movies, video, whatever. So you think like, tell an AI, write a song in the style of Nirvana, from the first album, with a voice like the lead singer, and the computer's capable of doing that because it has data reference, it has the sound already, it has all the component pieces necessary for that. when I get to the utopian piece of this, so I agree with you, it's dystopian now, and it's sort of stealing the soul or the spirit of what human was to create all the stuff in the first place. It's digitizing the spirit of art. It's the collective, like the billions of humans that created art. It's digitizing that. It's digitizing the spirit that created these great cultural movements in music and film, etc. But I think of it, you got to go further into the advancement when the disrupt is so total to society that the fabric of the way we think of society today fundamentally changes. For instance, like if you model a society in that it has transcended productivity, you model a society that transcended economy, it transcended money as a technology. It no longer needs it. It has no purpose anymore. Like there's no way to measure with it in a way that anyone cares about. You think of a society that is now healthy, and the entire Western medical complex no longer is what it was. There's no medicine to sell. There's so much medicine. There's so much hyperproduction of quote medicine, and there's all this modeling done that how to stay healthy is now known. That you don't need it. You think about like organs, and the systems can grow organs out of your own stem cells and DNA, and they're yours. It's like you get a brand new heart, and it can be implanted in a way that doesn't even cause scarring anymore. Like these ideas that right now would seem so sci-fi, would seem so futuristic. That's where I'm going to in my mind when I think of utopian, and I think there's going to be a big dystopian arc to get there, as the tools are ultimately used as part of that predatory scenario that I described earlier.
It's a bit like that classic saying, isn't it? Like it's always darkest before the dawn. Like we almost have to reach rock bottom to have almost like that epiphany, so to speak, and then that almost like awakening moment, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of part of that sadness that we've yet to figure out a way to awaken just because it's necessary. Instead, we wait until we get forced into the position of it, and it kind of gets forced upon us.
It's interesting how it almost seems like historically as well, isn't it? Like it always seems to be the times of the most ease and like blooming and bliss seems to be directly after like an awful event. Like, almost like all the decades after World War II, obviously, I know there was like a massive Cold War tension and stuff, but on a grand scale, whether it's like economically in like Europe and the US and stuff like that, like on the whole, it was like pretty peaceful times, especially obviously once the Cold War ended. Like I think that the sort of time I grew up in, to say like the first 20 years of my life was like, it was almost like as good a time as you could live as a human, as hope to live so far, almost like over the course of our history. I would go as far maybe to say that we know of, historically documented anyway. Something like that. So it is interesting how it always seems like there has to be like something massively bad happens. Like World War II happened. There was atom bombs. Millions and millions of people died, persecuted, all these things, and then afterwards it's almost like this little awakening moment. Everyone almost like realizing like how awful war is. Why are we doing this? There's a time of bliss, and then it's almost like whether it's like greed or things like that slowly rears its ugly head in human societies again, and then conflict arises.
Again, it's based on how humans relate to language. And right now we're very binary, very dualistic, and the pendulum swings. And so we go from kind of one side of the pendulum, and then that gets too polarized, and then it moves back to the other side. And those transitions take a very long time. They take decades, and maybe that will accelerate. But right now they've been taking decades. Probably in the past they took hundreds of years. But now it seems like it takes decades for these pendulums to swing. And it's something to learn from, and potentially nudge and influence in a way maybe to have it become more positive again. I think what's interesting now is that we're seeing a great polarization again, whereas instead of waking up from the previous polarization, moving into a more utopian time like you describe, and then thinking, wow, we should prolong this, it's actually degrading now once again back into polarity. And there's a lot of macro indicators for that, which is kind of mind-boggling that we have yet as a collective society realized we could intervene and upset these cycles and patterns that we're part of or disrupt them. And instead we're just allowing them to happen. And so I think this, time of polarization is of great concern.
Yeah. One thing that I'd be really interested to talk to you about, which you sort of briefly touched on earlier, you were talking about sort of, briefly said about the origins of mankind and stuff. I know that you have a bachelor's degree in anthropology, and I'm very interested in anthropology myself. there's obviously a hell of a lot of study and a lot of mystery into the evolution of humankind. So sometimes, you get here terms thrown around like the missing link. What separates us from other great apes or from other animals in the animal kingdom? A lot of people say like what separates us is sort of like the fact that we question our existence, for example. Like, what are your sort of like thoughts on theories on the evolution of mankind, and what made us sort of like branch off, from the other great apes into what we are now? Because we are clearly so different than in some ways than any other animal on this planet.
I think my answer might be kind of boring.
Okay, that boring doesn't mean it's bad though.
Yeah, I think that it's a natural process that occurs, and we have a tremendous hand in evolution, and I don't think we always accept that the choices that we make have tremendous influence on evolution and the planet. And maybe we started to make those choices first just on ourselves with different kinds of selective breeding or advantageous breeding, etc. But you get this very manipulative state in the frontal lobe of the brain that allows you to think about yourself, separate yourself from the rest of the environment, and make decisions that are very, very advantageous to you and advantageous to your collective. And the speed at which you evolve based on that, it dramatically increases. So let's roll it back 1,000,000 years, 800,000 years, 700,000 years, 500,000 years. In that period of time frame, you start to see, I think, people start to make choices that are incredibly advantageous to their own evolution. And then that get perpetuated and accelerated continuously then over that next 500,000 years. And the advantageous qualities for a period of time is to not be like the other animal species. They're not as manipulative of their environment. They're not developing as many core technologies. They develop some, but they live in relative, typical kind of harmony or more balance with their environment. We start to play with the environment. We start to make fire. We start to burn it up at our own, whim. We start to reshape tools. We start to take sticks and shape them to be more advantageous.
Yeah.
We start to model stones into other shapes, and we start to imagine shapes within in essence, like sculptures. Like a Aleutian hand axe is a sculpture from a much larger stone, and it gets brought down into this very advantageous tool, and then you can start to manipulate your environment, and in doing so, you now enact that upon the earth. You deploy that to the earth itself. And you do that over 500,000 years, and you give your own evolution a direction.
Yeah, I always talk about it as the analogy. I say it's like humankind's develop cheat codes. Like if you were playing like an old-fashioned computer game, like we've found this way to almost bypass the food chain in some ways, bypass the rules that apply to every other animal. We've sort of put in a cheat code somehow. I think it's almost like a fairly good analogy for it. But to ask you a bit more of an in-depth question then, because obviously you've got insane insight as somebody who is a shaman of ayahuasca and has had so many ceremonies and profound experiences. I think it's fascinating, that talk of consciousness, going back to when we would have first come down from the trees, like Homo erectus, the first ape to stand upright. And that the idea of what sort of pushed our brain forward. Some people theorize that it was the ability to make fire, and then as we were cooking our food, and as a result, when you cook food, you unlock the nutrients, so that let us have time to sit around rather than like a cow spends all its time just eating. It has to eat all the time because grass is so low calorie and they're so massive. They have to spend their entire day eating, so they don't have time to comprehend anything. The idea was it might have just been because we could cook food and we could unlock the nutrients, so we were sitting around and it let our brains have time to develop. Other people theorize that it was from humans, early apes, early human ancestors, whether it was accidentally or whatever, eating things like magic mushrooms, like psilocybin and things like that, and then that unlocked their sort of brains and sort of gave us all of these questions. What are your thoughts on things like that?
On the first part of it, I think that humans start to use their creativity very early, and I think it's very simple. So I envision, it's my own imagination. I'm not saying it's a fact in any way, but I just think of like two early humans, two proto-Homo erectus sitting around an anthill. They're eating some ants. One sticks a stick into the anthill and pulls out ants. And another one looks at it and then for some reason, knocks some of the bark off, breaks off one of the ends of the twig, sticks it in and gets more ants, and they both recognize it. The other guy copies it. And then that pattern just happens now ad infinitum to billions of people doing that same concept today, just improving technology. In terms of the idea that we utilized our environment in this expression of the advancement of consciousness and ultimately to language and further forms of imagination, codification, modeling, the core technologies that were made of life itself, whether they were plant-based or animal-based, I think is inevitable. I think it's obvious that that's what happened. So did people eat mushrooms? Yeah, of course. Did they use cannabis? Yes, of course they did. Did they also use all other kinds of plants and eat them and die and realize that they shouldn't have eaten those? That's exactly how they did it. It was self-oriented experimentation on the largest scale. And human doesn't, it doesn't take a lot to recognize and start to create taboos and prohibitions and knowledge around what you should and shouldn't do around here. I mean, rats do that. You use poison to kill rats and then other rats come and smell it and will never eat the poison again. Putting two and two together is not a uniquely human capacity. So I think humans first probably explored the plant kingdom and the fungal kingdom, figured out what was all right and what wasn't all right. I think lots of them died, in the hundreds of millions, billions of them, right? And those are our ancestors. They were the early knowledge gatherers for us. And that goes forward to then the expansion and development of consciousness. I think first we have to understand a theory around consciousness, which is that I think we are the assimilators of it. So I think biologically at a quantum level or a molecular level, we're assimilating consciousness. And that ultimately becomes part of a neural network that's more like the electrical level. And in that assimilation of consciousness, we do things that alter our consciousness all the time. Exercise will alter your consciousness. Breathing will alter your consciousness. Different kinds of plants and consuming different kinds of substances and chemicals will alter your consciousness. And so I think the alteration of consciousness and then the desire or need to try to communicate that leads ultimately to language and then a codified system of language that becomes part of our cultures. And so I think that it has to be inevitable that humans were influenced by everything they did. So I came up with a theory that is nature and nurture combined instead of having the polarity of the natural biological definitions or the nurture-oriented, the interactive influence on our evolution. I think it happened at the same time. I think we're changing ourselves molecularly all the time. A great modern example, that's microplastics. You're filled with them now. Whether you like it or not, you're part made of plastic. So you're a plastic human. You're also a heavy metal human. You're filled with heavy metals from industrialization that wasn't there a million years ago. Welcome to modernity. So you're plastic and metal. You're part doll and you're part metal that wasn't there before. And so that clearly was happening earlier in our history as well. And I'm also open to there being these big moments in history of where through those altered states, people had big awareness moments of phenomena that we struggle with. So, I often think, well, where did the origins of religion come from? Where did the origins of the belief in God come from? Where did the origins of the belief in deities come from? Those kinds of concepts. And I think it comes from people interacting in altered states of consciousness. Interesting.
One thing I find interesting talking to you, Hamilton, is you have very much like an Occam's razor approach to like everything in life. And I think that, I hope you don't mind me saying, I think some people would be, that aren't in your sort of circle, so to speak, might be surprised by that, because I think, you hear shaman, ayahuasca trips, all these things. To some people that don't know anything about it, they might think that it was almost like quite like a far out thing to do, but you're actually like a very common sense based human being. as I said, your Occam's razor, which people don't know, is basically it's like the most likely outcome is probably that, you know, or option is probably the one that happened. It's like that seems to be your approach on pretty much everything.
But I think that there's a lot of rationale to that. When I first got to the Amazon, I was having experiences of expanded consciousness. And many people have talked about awakenings in history. There are a lot of historical references for it. No one really knows what the triggers are or why. But I was having those experiences, and I wasn't looking for some false belief or delusional ideological explanation or escapism for what was happening. I was interested in the knowledge of the universe. And sadly, I wasn't finding the answers to that kind of knowledge in my own culture, or I would have stayed there. If I could have just gotten the answers, you know, in my early 2000s Western developed United States life, I wouldn't have had to go to Peru and ultimately go try to find mystics and, you know, people holding these ancestral lineages of wisdom. But I was in that period of time looking for a great teacher, like in sci-fi stories. I was looking for the wizard or looking for the mystic that might have some answers.
Or Yoda.
Yeah, exactly. I was looking for somebody like that. Like, hey, is there anyone out there who actually knows a little bit more about this place?
Yeah.
And like, you know, it doesn't want to just fill me with a pill or tell me a story about why I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing. You know, so I had the opportunity to really seek knowledge. And when I ended up in the Amazon, I met mystics, and they had a very specific role that I could relate to, which was medicine man. It wasn't just spiritual teacher, it was medicine man. And medicine man meant heal people, help them for real. Like there's someone comes to you with a real problem and they need a real acute intervention, and you have to produce that and get the results that you're looking for, or you're not medicine man. You're a charlatan. You're a fake if you can't do it. And so the people that taught me, the lineage that I got brought into, had a tremendous track record for the successes of their interventions and their healings that they performed. And I saw phenomena which, when I asked about, well, how did that happen? Like, what happened? You know, I got presented with a mythology about a phenomena that was physical. And so I knew that there was a scientific understanding that sat beneath it. We just hadn't studied, you know, these phenomena yet, or it hadn't been yet fully codified or understood. And so I was looking for those kinds of answers, and I was looking for a logical, reasonable explanation for the supernatural. And I was really fascinated by the idea that in our most logical, most rational forms of science, they were all butting up at that time against significant paradoxes. So we were at quantum paradox. We were at difficulty in being able to bridge different understandings about the universe. So I wondered why. That seemed no different to me than a religious paradox, or it seemed no different than a philosophical paradox. So if we found ourselves in other forms of paradox, it still showed that we were at a point of barrier of understanding. And so I was looking for that, and I explored it. And then I had experiences early on that were fascinating for me because they were scientific discoveries. And so I realized through these plant medicine ceremonies, you could make scientific discovery. And by that point, I was fascinated and hooked.
One thing that I think that's really interesting. I think one thing that I sort of became aware of about, like, I don't know, 5 years ago, might have been a bit longer, was when I was younger. I think I thought of things like, you know, you're either scientifically minded, or you believed in, you know, ghosts or the supernatural, or you were religious, or you're atheist, or things like that. And the older I've gotten and the more I've looked into things, I think there's a very thin line between what we would have talked about, say, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, as like magic or science. And as I said, I think, you know, basically the only thing that separates it is that science hasn't necessarily come up with an answer or discovered something or explored something yet. That's the only difference, isn't it? You know, you know, it's going back to what we were saying earlier about how there's almost like, you know, that team-like mentality. As I said, you know, whether you would be like, you know, religious or atheist, or you would be like a believer in the supernatural or like not. I think there's a very thin line between those two, and they don't necessarily need to be, like antagonistic like towards each other, which you see sometimes with certain people, like somebody might be like, oh, you're full of rubbish if somebody thinks that they've seen a ghost, and another person's like, well, no, this hasn't been documented by science, so you're just like an idiot or something like that, but there's actually like a very thin line between it. It's often it's just a lot of these things that we think of as supernatural right now, or as like quote unquote magic, are actually we just haven't quite got there yet to actually properly document it or explore it with science. And
I think we will. Science, first, for everyone to understand, is a method, well before it's an institution. And the original scientists were experimenters that figured out a method to try to understand fact from fiction and to work through beliefs and ideologies to try to find fact behind them. And it's, I think, an interesting part of our history that the first real scientific movements were paid for. They were sponsored by religions. And the religions were trying to prove their teachings now with this method. And sadly, for many of those teachings, the methods disproved them. And so there became a conflict, an inherent immediate conflict, that this scientific method that was being deployed to, in essence, try to prove religious teachings was now disproving those teachings. So you could see an immediate divide that would happen there. And over time, the scientific method became much more than just a method. It became an institution and a body of knowledge and thought, and highly funded, and then in many ways corrupted or altered, evolved. And I think at that point, that's where we are now, where because of this great divide, we never got to prove and disprove religions and just clean up that knowledge base. And then we never got to find the bridge or the merge points between what became the scientific body of knowledge and what would have been the spiritual or religious body of knowledge that predated the scientific body of knowledge. And then you found yourself in a camp where you had to identify yourself. Oh, I'm a scientist, or I'm a religious person, or I'm a spiritual person. And I just never found that I needed to be in any one of those boxes. I thought I was a scientific spiritual person who was interested in the universe, and I wanted to study the universe, and I wanted to study the universe in all of the different ways that were available to me. So I continued my scientific studies as I also explored mysticism and plant medicine, which is really an exploration of philosophy.
That's amazing, man. Going back to a bit, what you were saying earlier about when you first, came to the Amazon sort of in search of things, and you said that one of the things was sort of like you wanted to find out more about like the supernatural. Can you go into a little bit more depth about that? I know you spoke on the first time you were as our guest about sort of like an awakening you had. I think you said, did you say you were at your mother's house? You were like in her kitchen. That's when you first had your sort of like awakening and realized what you needed to do. But sort of expanding on that, on the supernatural, and this might almost sound like a daft question at first, but it's purely because I'm interested in the subject. We've had like psychic mediums on the show before, and we've sort of discussed and debated all sort of facets of the supernatural. So what are your sort of, as somebody that's curious myself, and as somebody that would be interesting on your take, what are your thoughts on things like, ghosts and that? What do you think that people are experiencing when they experience ghosts, if they are experiencing anything at all?
I think first that the supernatural is natural. And we have isolated ourselves from the natural. And I don't think there's anything natural about the modern way that we live. So when you're in an industrialized urban environment, you terraformed the nature, the natural. There was the natural there and all of its phenomena, including its climate and its energy. And I mean literally electrons when I'm talking about energy. I'm talking about like the electrons that are part of the atoms and the molecules, right? So you changed all of that. You brought in bulldozers. You brought in all these other kinds of materials. You changed the material physics of the place. And in doing so, you change the nature of the place, and then you change the nature of the typical phenomena that's found within the place. And I don't really consider that natural. I think that's a human invention. It's like being inside a giant hive and wondering why the hive behaves a certain way. Well, it's like you built cell on cell on cell on cell inside this giant hive, like I see, ant hives or beehives or termite hives in the jungle. And you see the same thing, roads to them, huge towering constructs of buildings made of earth, no different than the steel glass cities and the concrete cities we see today. So I think then you get a different phenomena that you live within, and it's a concocted environment. It's a giant kind of experiment at that point. And then if you live in it generation after generation after generation, you enculturate what it is to live within that environment. And you mythologize, you create mythology around the living in that environment. And then you create this difference between natural, supernatural, and the environments that you live in. So I ended up in the Amazon, that was a natural environment, and there's supernatural phenomena that's part of that environment. Completely just normal part of it. And if you don't understand that supernatural part, the people think that you're the crazy one. They think you're the one who doesn't understand the nature of the environment. And it can include, and it's in their mythology. Their mythology talks about these beings that are part of the forest. And you can see through them, but they glow. And they're in the forest, and if you don't know about them, it's like you wouldn't know trees if you went to the forest, or you didn't know vines, or you didn't know orchids, or you didn't know anything that was just part of the forest. It'd be like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you know that? And I ended up there, and I was a disbeliever. I didn't think there was anything to these stories. I thought they were all just fantasy mythologies, like our Disney movies and stuff like that. I didn't think there was anything real to it. And then one day there was one in my house. And this is a thatched roof house in the middle of the jungle with no electricity, and in the back room from where we were sitting with no ceilings, like you could see like across the entire space, there's this light going on and off, on and off. And I think someone's messing with us. I think that like someone's truly like playing with us. Someone is either right outside the window and they're flashing a flashlight in there, or they've somehow broken in and they're in the room turning a flashlight on and off. And I run back into the back of the house to go see what this is. And I open the door to the room, and I'm looking inside the room, and there's this thing standing there glowing. It's a human form about between 5.5 to 6 feet tall, and it's glowing. And you can see right through it. And
so you saw essentially what people in the West would describe probably as a ghost.
Probably. I don't know.
Yeah.
They didn't call it here a ghost. They thought a ghost was something else.
No, of course not. But I mean, for the average sort of, like Westerner that's listening to this, you essentially almost saw a ghost, what we would call a ghost.
Exactly. And I'm looking at it, and they call it here a lantern being.
Okay.
Whatever that would be. They call it a lantern being. That's in their mythology. We talk about 7 dwarfs. They talk about lantern beings. Like we talk about gnomes. They talk about this lantern being creature.
I say tomato, you say tomato.
Exactly. And so there was one standing in my house. It was evening time. I was completely sober. I was looking at it, and I was really scared for that first moment. I was shocked. Kind of all the hair stands on end, and then it ran out and right through the wall, and then ran off into the forest. And that was the end of it. And so that's the supernatural. And I think there used to be a lot more. Did you talk to anyone
after that about sort of what you experienced?
Yeah, of course. I told everyone about it. Yeah, and they told me, that's why that's in our stories. That's why we call that the lantern beings. Like they're of the forest. That's my point. Is that they have the local people have this mythology about what they see in the forest. And that's part of it. And it's just kind of normal.
Hamilton, was that with the bugs as well in that same story? I think I read it in your book.
It's in my book.
The flashlight.
Yeah. That was a wild evening. It's in my books. You can get it on Amazon. It's quite a tale. Yeah, it's in part 1.
Have you seen things like that since as well? Has that almost become like a semi-regular part of your life now that you live in the Amazon, or?
Not so much, because I live in areas where there's been so much transformation, which is my point. Like I'm right now in a city. I'm in a city of over 500,000 people. And
do you think that sort of puts the land out of touch with things like that?
Yeah, I think that they're just not there anymore. That's my point. So then it becomes like this supernatural phenomenon because we changed the place, is my point. We changed it so much so that it's not there anymore.
Yeah, what do you think it is about what we're doing though, like the terraforming that's putting off these beings, whatever they are? What's making them, do you think?
I don't think it's their habitat.
It's just not their habitat?
Yeah, I literally think it's that simple. That's Occam's razor.
Simple as,
that's not their habitat. There also aren't jaguars walking around the streets. And if you go further into the forest, you find jaguars. And the jaguars
I love the simplicity
get away
of
from
that
humans.
explanation. Yeah, I love the simplicity of that explanation. It's like, of course, if you if you like destroyed a forest, you know, then all the animals that normally live in the forest aren't going to live there anymore, you know. It's pretty simple in that regard.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question on this really quick?
Yeah, go on.
Hamilton, do they believe these lantern beings to be associated to humans in the same way that in the West we would associate ghosts to humans, or do they believe it to be a completely separate entity?
No, they think it's completely separate.
Right.
Completely. It's not, and that's why it's not a ghost in their mind. It's not a dead person whose spirit or soul is walking around the earth in the way we think of it in the West. It's not that. It's this other phenomena of the forest that lives in the forest, just like any other kind of animal or being or bird or insect lives in the forest.
So it's just like the same way that you can't see a lot of animals unless you put them under a microscope. We just haven't quite got like an accurate way in our normal lives to see these beings usually, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think
so. It's just the same as any other animal.
I think that's exactly right.
All right, I think that's a really interesting way to think of it, because I think that puts like a lot of clarity in my mind, at least, about exactly, you know, it's almost like it's just an animal, it's just another animal on this earth, but for whatever reason, with our specific senses, we just find it hard to normally perceive them.
I think that's exactly right. And to perceive them, you're in an altered state when you do it. And that's the point of the altered states that the medicine people in the forest go into, so that they can communicate with, see, interact with this other phenomena of the forest, which is why it's hard for me to relate to it as supernatural. It seems more like I need to change myself so that I can then enter into the natural. It's just part of it. It's another expression of that natural environment. And it's just like we use instruments in science to try to see more into that environment. We're not seeing it with our eyes when we see ultraviolet light or we see, electromagnetic radiation, or we're not seeing that specifically with our eyes. We use instruments to show us that.
Yeah, sure. Or even like, you know, they say there's like microscopic creatures that like live on our face and stuff, don't they? But I mean, we can't see them, but it doesn't mean they're not there, because apparently, you know, there's things that have documented them. So they're there.
Exactly. And I think that's a fascinating part of what we are, because we're trillions of cells, but we're also trillions of microorganisms at the same time. And it's hard to define the line between, you know, are you your microbiome? If you take your microbiome out of you, it's itself. It's certainly its own being. It's its own creature, but it lives within you and it's part of you. And it's also an important part of how you think. So part of your cognition and your cognitive capacity is running through this biological function of trillions of microorganisms. So I think of it in that sort of more expanded way, and then it can make more sense that some of this phenomena could just be part of Earth. And we've also had a lot of reasons in our history, like we were talking about religious wars. One of the first big conflicts humans have with each other is how to imagine and how to understand what's real and not real of this planet. And so a lot of people have been confining humans to one worldview for a long period of time. And now we have a big debate even about what's real and unreal about the planet, when I think there were probably many phenomena that we experienced as a collective that we now don't experience anymore, so it's easy to disbelieve it.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought it was really interesting. I remember I think it was just like a program I watched when I was a boy, but I thought it was really actually quite an eye-opening way of looking at things. And they were sort of like saying with a lot of like old pagan deities, they were saying like the only difference between these things being real and not was whether people believed in them, which I thought was like, when you think of it something like that, you're sort of like, huh, like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's rather than something like it's real or it's not. I think like, you know, if you believe in something, you're sort of like giving it power, and in a way from our almost like, you know, not believing them anymore, and, you know, as you said, like terraforming the earth, these things have almost become like smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where most people don't believe in them anymore.
Yeah, I work with people all the time that have difficulty, quote unquote, believing in spirits. It's not something that's easy for them to understand, or deities, or, you know, pagan deities, etc. Like, they just don't grasp it. And I try to help them look at it from a perspective not of comparing it to something physical, but comparing it to an aspect of our consciousness. And so I say, well, you have a word for something, you have a thought about something, you've seen effigies and artwork created about something. And so clearly there's something there. It's a question of where it is. It's not if it exists or it doesn't exist. It exists in our thoughts, in our words, in our imaginations, in our art, in our mythology, in our theology, in our religious beliefs, etc. So it's somehow part of Earth. Maybe the origin of it is human. Maybe humans created them. Maybe humans created them in their imagination, and when people believe in them, there they are. They're part of us. Like I watched a movie a long time ago and I can remember it in my mind. It doesn't even mean that movie exists anymore, but it exists in my imagination. Sure. Right? I have now that imagery within my mind, and I try to help people understand that might be what we're actually dealing with, and that the early religions weren't the idea that it was something else independent of us, but actually something we were auto-generating in this field of consciousness, and we were giving great importance and power to that thing that was kind of self-emerging from human imagination and the collective consciousness.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? I know that a lot of people think that I think the Old Testament, Moses talks about like the burning bush, and that's when he had almost like a lot of his revelations and stuff like that. And now they think that he was probably having like a psychedelic trip. Like he's explaining that he had like a psychedelic trip, and then probably was exploring things that maybe with our normal senses day to day you cannot experience, and that's what gave him this awakening.
Well, some of my most intense experiences came during sobriety from fevers.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not that I had to ingest something to have an intense experience. You talk to people who have near-death experiences, and they had, a tragedy lead to, or an accident lead to, or an illness lead to. So imagine, as an emerging species, all the things that we're trying to figure out that's causing these really expanded, extended states of consciousness, and then having an ability of language to come out of the experience and tell it to somebody else. It seems like a very rich field in which to create these kinds of ideas.
I also think, imagine how mad the world would seem. Like, I think even for someone like you that lived in sort of like out in the middle of nowhere in the Amazon for like a long time. Imagine before humans, like, quote unquote, sort of like started dominating the planet, and we were sort of on the way up, but we're still very much a part of the food chain, just hunter-gatherer lifestyles, no big settlements. Imagine how actually insane just everyday life would have seemed to us as humans, and how, there wouldn't have been any choice to be in tune with nature or not. You were in tune with nature, and that was like your life, whether you wanted to be or not. You were a part of the food chain. Every day you would have come across like a plethora of like fascinating animals, because obviously all the other animals would have been a lot more widespread, where they hadn't, because there was no deforestation or us, culling numbers to make certain animals, less dangerous to humans or anything. And obviously the population of mankind was an absolute tiny fraction of what it was today. Like, whether it was things like disease or just conflict with predators, or even our prey ourselves. Imagine being a hunter-gatherer hunting like a woolly mammoth, or being in fear that like a cave bear might come for you or your children that night, or something like that. Like, that would have been an insane. Like, it almost sounds like almost like psychedelic even explaining it. Do you know what I mean? In terms of how far out it seems.
It's intense. When I first lived in the Amazon, upriver from where I lived, there were no permanent inhabitants. So the area hadn't been overhunted and overfished. It was primary forest, hadn't been logged. And within every 5 to 10 minutes in the forest, you would come across animals, all different kinds of animals. Some of them run around in packs, some of them are solitary, some of them are in flocks, etc. But you would come across them, and it's constant. And then you go to the rivers and you go to fish, and the fish are constant. And so you become immediately in tune with nature. You become immediately balanced with it. And if you're in place with great predators, you're aware of it all the time. You have to be protective of your kids all the time. It's no different than now the way parents walk around on streets, making sure that the kid's not too close to the street, because it's not a lion predator, it's a bus that runs them over and kills them.
Yeah, sure.
And so it's that vibe, right? And compared to the mind that we live in today, this kind of urban mind, modern mind, suburban mind, the natural mind is in a completely different visionary state. You're seeing the world from a different lens, and you're operating on a completely different set of patterns or algorithms about how to be able to operate within that space.
Sort of like in a bubble. Do you have any sort of, because I'm fascinated by wildlife, do you have any sort of like interesting stories of encounters with certain wildlife? I know obviously the Amazon famously has like, massive anacondas, and I've heard biologists and stuff say that, if you go deep into the Amazon, you will find like insanely massive anacondas and stuff. I'm not sure if they're in Peru or not, but have you got any sort of like crazy, almost noteworthy stories of animal encounters and things like that?
Well, the largest anaconda I ever came across was 6.2 meters.
That's insane.
So that's a big snake.
Over 18 feet, sort of over 18 feet,
Yeah, 20 feet. It was over 20 feet. The largest one I ever came across was a little over 20 feet. That's big enough to eat a person. So you know that you're out there with animals that have you in their food chain.
I've heard a lot of people say as well, what you don't appreciate when you hear something like that, even when you hear of like a 20-foot anaconda, is like the girth of them is the same sort of circumference of like a large man. So it's like when you actually see it in person, it's not just the length, it's the overall size of it. It's just awe-inspiring, I've heard. Yeah,
they're massive and they're incredibly heavy. They live in the water because they're so heavy. They're very agile in the water. I think that some of the kind of more interesting moments wasn't just with the big animals, it's with the smaller ones. So I remember I was swimming in a river. This is a great one. I was swimming in a river, and the water's very dark colored, so you can't see into it. You can't see what's in there in the water, right? And there was a person in a canoe that was fishing nearby, like within 5-10 feet of me, and pulled out a giant piranha about this big. And so like right next to me, pulls out this giant piranha, and I'm looking at it going, that can't be good, That was a fun one.
Yeah.
Just that, that's serious.
Well, especially when you're thinking there's probably, because obviously they don't really attack on their own, do they? There was probably hundreds of ones
schools
in there as well.
Huge schools. There are huge
you.
schools of thousands of them, and I think I'm swimming in a huge school of piranha. But I actually had a very balanced existence with nature. Nature has you in balance with it if you're in balance that way. So it wasn't like I was being attacked by animals and things like that. I was more, I was the fish out of water when I was first there because I'd come from suburban environments. I'd just gotten out of the university. I didn't even know how to walk in the Amazon. You walk differently. You talk differently. You swim differently. You move through the forest. It took me about a year and a half just to retool how I lived to be comfortable there. And when you're like that, you make a lot of noise. And that's not common for the other animals, Yeah. And my favorite time was when the forest floods. And it floods deep enough that you get over the lower dense foliage and plants. It grows in 4 layers. So the bottom layer, like the ground layer, is already covered, and then the next layer, which is about usually 9 to 12 feet tall, is the water level's higher than it now. And so now the forest, instead of being dense, just looks like the trunks of trees everywhere. And you can actually, they're well spaced out, and so you can float a canoe through them. And you're about 12, 15 feet higher up the trunks to be able to see what's up in the canopy. And you can move silently through the forest, completely in silence. And so the animals don't pay any attention to you. And that's fascinating to see. So you can be with all the monkeys that are in the trees and the different birds and reptiles and things. And they have a very dynamic life up in the canopy of the trees. And it was my favorite time to float in silence through this flooded part of the forest and be able to just navigate in a canoe. It's so fluid. It's a really incredible feeling.
Well, I guess that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Like the top, the forest canopy, the top of the trees and stuff have their completely own unique ecosystem to the bottom. So when you're experiencing that, you're in a completely different ecosystem, even though you're in the same place, essentially.
Exactly.
It's quite fascinating, isn't it?
And the ease of movement, too, because typically to move through the jungle is pretty tough. It's dense, it's uneven, it's not easy to walk, it's slippery, there's, constant scenarios that if you were like slip and fall, you can't put your hand out, you can't brace yourself, anything, because of the different numbers of different kind of spiky trees and plants and stuff that are out there.
Yeah.
And so to be able to move silently, calmly, with very little effort, gliding through the forest and being able to be part of the canopy's ecosystem is beautiful.
Do you ever? I mean, this is just almost as as an ignorant Englishman that's never been to the Amazon. That's like heard a lot of stories though and is interested. Do you have to worry sort of about things like botflies? Like, you know, you hear about like Westerners get lost in the Amazon and then they get botflies and there are things hatching out of them and you know, it sounds almost like horrible to somebody that lives in a pretty tame country. You know, is that something that you even have to like think about, or? Mike, probably seems like a funny question to you, but
no, yes, those things are real. Botflies are real. It's more common in your animals. You know, like your dog might get botflies.
Right.
If you do get lost in the forest, though, and you don't have, you know, a place to regularly bathe and things like that, then yeah. But if you have proper hygiene and stuff, then you typically don't get them. But they do exist. My dog had botflies a couple months ago. We extracted them, and it was now it's feeling much better. So those things do exist. One time, only once did I ever have a botfly, so I can say I've had that experience. That was a really interesting experience to have.
You tick that box. Yeah.
Yeah, I ticked the box of having had malaria, dengue fever, a botfly. I've experienced from the microorganisms and the protozoas all the way to the larger ones. But it's 20 plus years and it only happened once and it was only one. So I don't think it's fair in the mindset to think like, oh, that's how it is all the time. And I was, you know, in a time of when I was deep in the forest and stuff. So, yeah.
I didn't know that you'd had like malaria and dengue fever and
I've had all of those. Yeah.
I can see what you mean now when you said that you were going through like, you know, these things can give you like psychedelic trips. Like I bet having something like that, I can imagine that was a rough time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Malaria was very interesting.
Where were you when both of those things sort of took hold?
Both times I was deep in the forest. When I had malaria, I was really deep in the forest. Yeah, I had to evacuate myself out of the forest. I had to get locals to carry me to a boat and then get me from the boat to it took about 24 hours to get to a hospital. That was a harrowing experience. I was in
whilst going through like a shamanic attack as well, wasn't it, Hamilton? With that I remember reading that in your book.
That's
and
in the book as well.
Insane,
yeah. That was tough. Shaman had early on taken me through a period of time that they called the tests, and their idea of the test is very Matrix, like if you pass the test, this won't kill you, kind of a thing.
Right. Okay.
So I experienced that, and also had malaria at that time, and made it back. Luckily, made it back to some Western medical attention to be able to deal with the fever that I had. But the fever was so interesting. The fever was very hot. It's hard to understand why I wasn't worse affected by it, but it was well over 108
like over 40 degrees.
What's that?
Sorry, yeah, 40 degrees. When I said 40 degrees, I meant centigrade, obviously.
Yeah,
like
no, it was over 44.
Yeah,
I was over 44. Really? Yeah, it should be like
that
convulsive
is crazy.
Death. Yeah, it should have been.
That is crazy.
It should have been. Yeah. I was measured. When I got to the hospital, they measured me at 44 and then 43, and they couldn't understand why I was conscious and communicative. Like this was like a big mystery to them. But I was in a vision. I was not in any more an ordinary state of consciousness. But I was conscious enough to be able to navigate for over 24 hours to the hospital.
Do you think in hindsight, the fact that you were under the influence of these plants was helping you?
That's what the medicine people told me. They said that the plants kept me alive. That was their explanation for it, but I don't have an explanation for it. I know that in my experience of it, I was held in this other state of non-ordinary reality for a very long extended period of time that was filled with visionary mythological beings. So I would have like a moment where I realized I was on a boat headed down this river, and then I would be gone again, and I would be in this other altered state, interacting with things that I thought of like angels or light beings. Like it did not make sense to me, and I had very little capacity at that time to relate to ordinary reality. So I would get to a place, ask for help. People would help me. They didn't take advantage of me, which was very kind of them to be helpful. I would get help, and then I would be in this altered state again. And there were these moments of intervention that I think kept me alive along the way until I was finally out of hospital.
How long did it take you to get better from that?
Well, at first I went misdiagnosed, and so I had what they call the recaída. It's the second burst of it, which took 2 weeks that happened. And that was the part that actually took me through the legit near-death experience, which was also a fascinating experience. And then on the opposite side of that, it took about 6 months. So once I made it through a month of actually having malaria, it took 6 months to recover.
What about the dengue fever?
Dengue is a completely different illness, you know. So you have a different set of symptoms.
Where were you when you caught it?
Dengue felt like truly the most systemically painful. Dengue was very odd that way. It felt like every cell was in an excruciating, exaggerated pain. And you feel like obviously systemically wrong. It's not like when you have a cold, you feel like where you have the cold, you're sick. This was just like through my being was sick. But it wasn't so supernatural in its context. It was just about surviving it and being, staying connected to what I call spirit to survive it. It was just so overwhelming that it just required weeks and weeks of bed rest. And then you have to be very careful with it to not get any other kind of illness, because then you can hemorrhage. It's a unique illness in that it weakens the cell walls and your capillaries, and so then then your cells can burst and you can have hemorrhaging fever, and when that happens, you die. And so you just have to be very careful during that time. From different mosquitoes. Both of them are transmitted from mosquito.
So it was mosquito bites on both occasions that gave you malaria and dengue fever?
Yeah, there are certain mosquitoes that can carry malaria and certain that carry dengue. In both cases, I only had it strong once in the whole time that I was here. And then you become obviously very careful about not going through malaria areas. You become much more sophisticated in understanding the forest and where you are.
Those little tykes. I know that Drew wanted to ask you some questions more specifically about ayahuasca ceremonies. Obviously, as you know, Drew's very interested in them and has been out to be with you at your Blue Morpho retreat. I know that one thing that we were both, as me and Drew are both massive music lovers, and before Drew actually gets into the ceremonies, the ayahuasca ceremonies themselves, Drew was saying obviously that the music is a massive part of the ceremonies that you lead. And he was saying, that you've got, I'm gonna make him blush now. He was saying you have like a really good voice and stuff, and that when you're doing this, you clearly have a lot of rhythm, and that you're banging the drums, and you've got these like shakers as well and things like that. We were interested as people that that are like massive music lovers. How much of an important part of these things to you is music? Was music a big part of your life growing up? If so, what are your sort of earliest musical memories? What music inspired you? Do you listen to a lot of music yourself?
I love music. I would classify myself as a music lover. I think music's incredible. Early on, I was influenced, I think first by probably the music my mom liked, which came from the 60s and early 70s and stuff, because you're like really young, so it's whatever she's listening to. And then as I got older, I became very young a fan of reggae music and rock and roll. So I loved rock and then heavy metal and reggae at the same time, which is kind of odd for like a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, listening to like
That's
Peter
awesome,
Tosh and Bob Marley, and then I'd flip over to Guns N' Roses and Metallica. And
awesome, awesome.
So my first concert was AC/DC. And
awesome.
That was great. Like I loved AC/DC. They were great.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I loved music, and then I got into all different kinds of music as I just got older. I just expanded more and more and more. I loved Led Zeppelin. I loved I loved everything. Almost everything. As I got older.
Do you mind me asking just the specifics? So what was it your mum was listening to that you liked when you were young? Can you remember any specific artists or?
My mom liked Bob Dylan, and she liked
those folk artists.
Yeah, she liked folk artists. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she liked musicals. She liked folk artists and musicals, and she liked some country western that she would listen to.
Yeah, I'm a massive fan of like Townes Van Zandt and stuff, who I think is quite an underappreciated guy, but I think he just had the poetry in his music is just. I just find like mind-boggling. Obviously, he's very sort of cult classic country western folk player, isn't he, in America and things like that.
And then there was some classical music that was there too. I enjoyed some different versions of classical music. And then, as I got older, that's when I started just to get into my own music. I loved Ozzy Osbourne.
Yeah. What a legend.
Yeah.
That's the thing, though. I mean, I think music is quite psychedelic.
It is. It's an altered
state. It can
state.
take you to such crazy places.
Yeah.
You can go on this roller coaster ride just listening to music, and otherwise completely sober.
Absolutely.
And I find that's one of the most amazing things about music. Like, music blows my mind every day, I would say.
It's an altered state. If ordinary state is non-musical, then music is an altered state. And it allows you to imagine. It takes you through emotions. It's moving when you listen to it. And I loved that. I loved Pink Floyd. I loved, there's so many. It's hard to even imagine. I liked Rage Against the Machine. And then I would flip over to like Tracy Chapman. And then I would move from there to... Yeah, exactly. And then I'd move from there to, like Burning Spear, a reggae big group. And then, maybe from there I would end up... like with Enya or something. I don't know.
Sure.
Just flip around to all these different genres. And then from there I could end up listening to a Metallica song again or something. I don't know. It was like, I loved all of it. I wasn't like just stuck in one genre. No. I wanted to go everywhere in my music. I wanted to experience all the different flavors that I related to. And it was very powerful. Red Hot Chili Peppers. And funky. I liked their influence too.
I'm definitely on exactly the same boat as you. I mean, one of the things I find is it's almost like beautiful that you can even do it. I might sometimes on the way to work listen to like a completely different genre. Say I listen to like folk music on the way to work, and it could be the most like beautiful folk music you've ever heard. Maybe it might even be a traditional piece of British folk music that nobody even knew who wrote it. It was just sort of found in some old, newspaper from like the 1600s, and there's just some lyrics in, and it's something like that. And then on the way home, I might listen to something like Metallica or Sepultura or something like that. And it's crazy how different they can make you feel. But as I said, almost like being almost open to that, not pigeonholing yourself, and just being almost like a music fan first, rather than like a metaler or a reggae guy or something. It's like experiencing all these flavors. As you said, like I think the older I've gotten, the more I appreciate things like classical music. Like some of these things are such beautiful pieces of art, and I think I am always amazed, and I think that people maybe don't maybe think I'm being over the top, but I think some of the craziest sort of emotions I felt, or maybe not emotions isn't the right word, I don't know, but is like, say, like working out and listening to a piece of music that speaks to me, and when you mix obviously the scientific explanation of like the happy hormones you say you experience when you're working out, like endorphins and things like that are rushing through my body, combined with a piece of music that I love, can make me feel completely euphoric. And I think
agree.
That's why I do it. I think that's why I do it, And I even say to people, like, to try and put it in perspective, like, that is my church. That is, to me, that is my version of church. And I think it probably comes across to people in almost like a weird meathead way, but I don't mean it like that. I mean it in like a spiritual way. Like, to me, that's like a spiritual thing.
It's a transcendent experience. You're connected in that moment and you feel it. And I agree completely. And music is capable of that transcendental experience. I think people saying that it's not that way is odd to me. Like, why aren't they connecting to it in that way and being moved by it? Music
I know what you mean.
I've heard super important.
Yeah, I remember I was watching a program once, and some guy, he was asked what music he listens to, and he said, I don't listen to music. I don't like music. And I thought, how can you like not like music? That's such like a broad statement, because surely there's something for everyone. Even the most like almost like, even if you were just that guy that only listens to like one genre or even one band, like to such a blanket statement to say you don't like music, that's like saying you don't like food or something, like. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And nowadays I love chill step. I love. I like listening to music that has deep bass and melody to it. I love melody.
Yeah, I'd love to like send you some like folk music or something, Hamilton, just like stuff that I listen to, and just almost get your opinion on it or something like that. Just something for you to listen to when you've got like a spare 10 minutes. Because I think some of the old British, sort of like Gaelic British sort of folk music is some of the most beautiful, like just purely beautiful music you could possibly listen to. Like, insane. So I'd love to like send you some. I'll find a way to. I think Drew's got your contact details, so I'll find a way to send you some stuff just for when you have a rainy day, so to speak.
Thank you. Please do. I'd love to listen to it.
It's awesome as well, like what we say with music, with enjoying like the improvisational nature of music, and like when great musicians jam and everything. Like I know we appreciate that. Me and Calum like jam quite a lot on kind of get into the flow state, get into the zone. And for me, like with ceremonies and watching kind of and being a part of like Hamilton ceremonies as well, it's almost like the improvisational flow state of being in a jam with nature, and it's got very rhythmic, very musical elements to that, and it always like blows my mind. I remember when you were saying, Hamilton, about almost interacting with nature in a certain way, where they will become the insects and the bugs will become a part of the experience, almost like in a rhythmic nature, and like come in exactly on cues with points. And it's just like when you go in this almost expanded nature of communication, like there's something musical about it. There's something about how music can, or that rhythmic and vibratory experience of like doing that can like almost communicate with like more things around you. So yeah, I thought that was pretty mad. I don't know if you could maybe tell the guys about that, how some of your experiences in ceremony with like almost communicating with the other energies around you, like musically.
Yeah, it happened last week. Last week it happened. It was
wow.
amazing. We were out in the jungle. We were in ceremony. And first of all, I think it starts with a recognition that it can happen, and you invite the nature around you to participate. Like inviting a bunch of bandmates to participate, like get in on the jam. And so you're asking them to, and then you have to dispel your disbelief or suspend your disbelief that it could even happen, and then a phenomena starts to happen, and you provide them a rhythm, you provide the whole space a rhythm, like the insects and the frogs and the birds and everything are all around us, right? So they're all there, and you provide a rhythm to the ceremony, and once the rhythm gets going, it could be a rhythm like this. Just really simple, maybe like 120, 160 BPM. And you start to then give a melody to it, the other animals will start to participate. And the crickets will come in on syncopated rhythms, the frogs will provide accents. And even when you come to a stop, when you come to a stop, like things will happen. And in this last week, it was phenomenal because there was also it happens here a lot where it's raining somewhere else, but it's thundering where you are. So you don't have the rain yet, you just have the thunder and some flashes of light. And so there was this frog and this bird that were playing inside the Icaros. And when we would come to like a lull, they would come out and start to share their song as part of it. And then on 2 or 3 occasions where we would come to a stop in the Icaro itself, I would call to the thunder, and right when we stopped in that silence, the thunder would hit. Boom! Like like this huge, huge exclamation point to the, some like huge effect at the end of it. And so it seemed like the whole thing was synced, and it's a musical phenomena. If you don't believe it, you got to come experience it, because it is actually true. It's mind blowing that you could be in sync with nature, and that nature could participate in your creation of nature.
Jam.
I love that. I love how that whole sort of idea of like almost like nature suddenly being in harmony and almost like joining in. And I think that's the difference. Like, there's different ways of doing music, and you hear lots of like big, very successful bands. They are like song bands, and what I mean by that is like they are very good at like learning a very specific piece of music and then playing that over and over again, which is of course what a song is. And then you have other musicians that maybe aren't so good at that or don't choose to do that, but what they are good at, as you said, it's almost whether you want to call it as like a jam, and there's this weird thing where you can connect with certain people and get into this weird flow state, and you're sort of reading each other, and it's going back and forth, and it's exactly what you're explaining, but you're explaining on a wide level. You're saying almost like the animals getting into it and everything, and I freaking love that. Even as a concept, let alone as like an actual reality. But even just with between people, the idea that you can do this and you're just like feeling and adding to it, it's like there's this conversation going on, but it's not verbal conversation. And even the idea of that, or the ability that we can tap into it, is I just love that. That in itself like blows my mind. It's just beautiful.
Yeah, I think that flow state is what we're talking about, right? Like, you connect with others in an extraordinary way. It's a supernatural way. It's a flow state way. It's a higher dimensional way. However you want to describe that phenomena, but you guys flow together, and you're in sync, and that happens jamming, and it happens because of the music. The mind frees itself from the clock, and you move into the rhythms and the music of the flow of the instruments and the sounds that you're making. And it's the same with nature. But like I say, it starts with welcoming nature to enter that flow with you. I think nature is in that flow, and we're the ones who decide to be in a different flow. So when we actually
100%, we take ourselves out of it, don't we?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. This is the rhythm of the night.
Exactly.
So that was on my mind so much, I just had to say that then. Drew, did you want to talk a little bit, ask some questions about your more in-depth ayahuasca stuff?
I just had, it was almost like a personal question, but in my experiences with, kind of ayahuasca experience, I should have asked this on the academy calls actually, but like, it really interests me when I hear about people's experience about going into vision, and it's more like, a lucid like space that you can go into where you can see other people or visions of your life, almost like a dream of your life, and all of that kind of thing. Like, I've never experienced anything like that. For me, it's always been like pure like geometric, like a geometric ride in nature, you know, and like pure visionary, but like very geometric colors. And I know you spoke a few times about almost like going through the vision, and I'm thinking, have I not actually kind of been through the vision yet and actually is it like through those geometric patterns and everything that you would come out to the other side and then have those more experiences? Like, it's almost like I'm just experiencing the onset and then not actually broke through into the vision where you can, I know you say like you can imagine like going to the sea and then you're in the sea and like the sea's all around you and all this kind of stuff. Like, because I find those aspects like really interesting, but I haven't actually got there yet or been shown it. It's just been a pure geometric ride of just like, whoa, you know. So just ask that.
Yeah, there's a number of, I guess, categories of visions. Right, so there's where people see all the geometric colors in 2D. They're when they see them in 3D, and then where they're in them, immersed in them. So that's like kind of seeing them in like 4D. And then there's this phenomena where they form tunnels or portals or gateways into other visionary states. And people express when they go through those, they really do feel like they got transported beyond the body and beyond witnessing just the geometric patterns, and they end up in a true state of other, whether it's, like I say, being in the sea, in the ocean, whether it's being underwater, whether it's somewhere out in outer space or another star system. Those are, or even becoming a tree, like they talk about shape-shifting into other forms. So I don't know if you've yet to get there, but those are the experiences that people describe.
Yeah, I've definitely like felt like the merging with nature and almost becoming other things, or like becoming a complete part of it. But it always interests me that people could almost live out aspects and scenarios that have happened in their past, or actual like direct communication with other people and things like that. But I haven't got there yet, so I think I've got to move through the tunnel and keep going with it and have that as an intention of like, I want to experience that. I think that's pretty cool. Another one I was going to ask as well, like about there's a guy called Graham Hancock that I really like, and he talks a lot about prehistory and we touched on it earlier with like the origin of the human species and everything, and like he's had visions in his ayahuasca experiences of like past civilizations and Neanderthals and also like alien interaction and that, and it's such an interesting area for me, this idea of like, when we expand our consciousness, we can actually there's no space between us and other, so we can have these direct communications with like higher forms of consciousness and that. So I was going to ask you if you've ever had any visions of like anything in history, or like seen it of like a time period in as a direct visionary experience. And then also about like kind of the alien encounters, because I was in my head, I love this idea of like we were actually seeded here by an alien like civilization, that's where the missing link is. So I was hoping that was what you were going to say earlier, but yeah. It's right. Yeah, so I was just wondering about those, if you would mind talking about it.
I think opening up deep history is fascinating, and you can ask the Earth in these altered states to share with you its history. There's, I think, only one history. There's the true history, and then a lot of people tell stories. So I think we have to go into the altered state, connect with Earth, and ask Earth to show us Earth's history. And in that, you can have many, many fascinating journeys. And once you set that intention to go on that kind of journey into history, you'll see all sorts of evolutionary phenomena associated with Earth. And it is common to see Earth being interacted with by presences, consciousness, beings from other parts of the universe. Non-physical. I've never seen like a spaceship or something like that. So I can't fulfill those desires for anyone out there. But I've seen influence. I've seen things that represent influence of other forms of consciousness to Earth and transformations that have happened in the past. And those are visionary experiences. It's hard to be able to say that that's a fact or not a fact. So I've heard of Graham Hancock's theories, and I think those are theories. Guy. Yeah, he's a fascinating guy. I agree. I think those are theories, and they're being corroborated by a lot of people who have those experiences, which could lead to more evidence and potential understanding about it. So I've seen those kinds of things, and maybe it is part of the missing link. I'm willing to speculate at that point that what ultimately spurred humans on in their evolution was influence from something beyond Earth itself that could be very real. But we don't have evidence for it. We have visionary experiences, and I think it's important to highlight that there's a lot of people out there telling you because of a visionary experience that's how it is. And I don't think that that's good science. I think good science is to say, okay, we have another data point. There's another person who had that kind of a vision. But we don't have any other evidence for it yet. But it is fascinating to me, and I'm open. I like to start the debate, though, with humans know a lot less about the planet than more.
Yes.
They know a lot less. So we as a collective, sadly, know a lot less about what's really going on. And we have a 4 or 5 billion year history to look at. And when you get into deep history, it gets really glossed over instead of being very granular. So like yesterday's history is very granular. Like this thing happened and that happened and this person said this and that person said that. But in deep history, they're like, oh, well, over 20 million years or over 200 million years. Imagine 200 million years compared to like 3 decades or 4 decades of your history, right? They just gloss over everything. We have no idea what happened during that time.
Yeah, again, I love your measured and reasonable approach to it, Hamilton. And I think, it adds credence to everything that you do say and everything that you actually do believe in. I would love to speak to you for another 2 hours, but we actually have to get out of here because of sort of like time constraints. Is there anything that you'd like to tell like your UK audience on the radio or anything before we say our farewells? Or like any message or anything that you would just like to get out there at all, anything?
Yeah, I think that if you're interested in these kinds of conversations, I just think it's really important to know you're not alone. And that a lot of us are explorers, not just seekers, but explorers in consciousness and in our imagination and mind. And to embrace that in our lives, it's an incredible part of our life to be able to be imaginary and also rational and grounded and sound in our reasoning. And that we don't have to be in one camp or another. We can bring a rational understanding and message to what we're thinking about. But that it's fun to explore the mind and it's fun to explore what our Earth is and the phenomena that it holds for us. And it makes life special and dynamic. And so if you feel that, know you're not alone. And at the beginning of the show, I talked about the mystery school. Know that there's actual groups and communities out there who are exploring this. And if you want to, you can be part of ours. And that it's a special thing to get to explore the mysteries of the universe and be alive at this period of time. And if you're interested in community, join us. And I just really appreciate everyone who's exploring these ideas.
Well, thanks very much, man. I really appreciate you coming on the show again, coming on Pandora's Box and on AW Radio. And I appreciate as well just, not just you coming on, but the work that you're doing in life. I'm a fan. Keep doing you and keep doing everything that you're doing. And hopefully we can talk again in the not too distant future, man.
Oh, fantastic.
Thank you so much, Hamilton.